the Ostrom Workshop Colloquium. This year, if you haven't noticed, we're actually focused on IU scholars in a lot of ways. Obviously, we have people coming from on and off campus, but trying to get to know our colleagues a lot better and get folks involved here at the workshop. Today we have Dr. Keitlyn Alcantara from the anthropology, assistant professor in anthropology. Yeah, you're assistant. Yeah, and from the anthropology department. She joined us about 5 or so years ago. It seems like a while. 2020. And it has some exciting work going on in what the largest scope of food systems. So our new format this year has been about 45 minutes of a talk, and then we have time for conversation and Q&A and following that. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Diana for putting this all together.
Back meetings.
All right, well, thank you everybody for welcoming me here. Today I'll be talking about the Mesoamerican milpa and specifically the weeds that are found within it. And thinking about how those weeds end up influencing social systems that mimic some of the lessons that we learned from the milpa. So this is from a book project called Ecologies of Resistance, Archaeology of the Past and Present in Tlaxcala, and it's specifically from a chapter called Eating Weeds, which is about how weeds or useless plants, as they're deemed in industrial contexts, are actually part of the strategies of sovereignty in this particular context and in other contexts. So I'm going to start introducing maize as a social and economic access, then start to talk about how the milpa has evolved as a collaborative system, both biologically and socially, looking at how interspecies methodologies shift the way we think about collective governance and commons, and then circling back around to think about how that changes the way we think about sustainability. And I'll conclude by talking a little bit about a project that we have here on campus, the Healing Garden, and how these ideas are being put into practice with our students and with community partners. And if you notice, there's some weeds in the corners of all of the title pages, so you can learn some of this. One is Mirasol. It's what comes up in the cornfields this time of year. They'll be just pink all over the place. So this book project started through my archaeological dissertation. So this conversation starts actually 700 years in the past at the site of Tepeticpac, Tlaxcala. This is an interesting site because it was established in about the 1300s after a period of drought that was happening in the Americas, forced populations to move from the northern deserts, south into central Mexico, around where Mexico City is today. And in that period, central Mexico became just overcrowded. So many sites and so many populations, one of them being the Mexica, who are also known as the Aztec Empire. And Tlaxcala and the Mexica have an interesting relationship because in that period, y'all know of the Aztec Empire because it expanded extensively. But Tlaxcala was one of the only small polities to resist the Aztec Empire. And I've been part of a project that's seeking to find out how and why they were able to resist where everybody else became allies and tributaries. So stories that are showing up are made possible by interdisciplinary work with the Tepeticpac Archaeological Project and the Proyecto Arqueológico Tepeticpac, which are the same but different. One is run by Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, the Mexican kind of state-governed archaeology. And the other one is a joint US and Mexican team. And so over the past 10 years, there have been a lot of publications coming out on the archaeology side showing how an analysis of the site, how the site's structured, gives us an idea of how society was structured. And one of the ideas that comes out is this idea of collective action, collective governance. That while the Aztec Empire was very hierarchical, had a king, and systems of a lot of inequity. At Tlaxcala and Tepeticpac, we see evidence that there was a lot more of a collective system of rotating governors who were elected officials. And it was also a space that was welcoming a lot of migrants who were escaping Aztec oppression and coming from other parts of Mexico. Another interesting part about Tlaxcala as a case study is that when the Spanish arrived in 1519, the Tlaxcalteca allied with them. This meant that they had a unique position within New Spain and that kind of greater freedom to develop their own version of their state. It's one of the smallest, it is the smallest state in Mexico because of this. It has the boundaries that it used to have in the late post-classic. And so all of these things are key to understanding the argument that I'm making in this presentation, which is that a lot of those ideologies that existed before the Spanish continued on in this space, specifically because of its relationship to colonization and how its history has played out. So just to give you a little bit of a view, this is the site. It's a hilltop site. One of the things that of note here is all of these white spaces in the map. Those are terraces, a lot of them agricultural terraces. When we were doing excavations in 2015, many of those terraces are being used today as agricultural terraces as well, are milpa. And so there's this reuse and return to space as well. In addition to the terraces, another thing that's interesting about the site is that these gray areas here are plazas that are open. So these are areas that would have been gathering places, and they're not like, for example, if any of you have been to the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, this big area, the main plaza there is very closed off for elites only, right? You couldn't just wander in there or have like a potluck in there. Whereas here we have plazas that are in neighborhoods. So we have these common spaces that people were able to access. So as I mentioned, this project is a collaborative project and a lot of people have been working on it over time. Most of the work that has been published by Farger et al. And Lopez Corral et al. Is focusing on the material remains, the architecture, what's been found. But my focus has been on the food systems, on the relationships to land. I was a bioarchaeologist when this project started, and so I was looking at ancient foodways and how we could understand social organization based on how food was distributed and becoming part of individuals' bodies. And since then, I've expanded to look at how those systems of distribution can be analyzed with contemporary milpa projects and see parallels and kind of examples of how they might have played out in action. So I want to take a moment to make an unexpected connection between Indiana and the site of Angel Mounds, which is in the south of Indiana. Similarly, this is a site that doesn't have a lot of massive temples. It's also from around the same time period. So this was a site that by AD 1000 had maize that had moved north from central Mexico, and that had, just a second, the Zoom in the way, and had similarly had maize as a central axis around which the society was turning. There were other things that adapted from further south to the north, squash and beans, but also things like maypop, which is a passion fruit that is adapted to Indiana, pawpaws, which is a type of soursop or guanabana. So we see all of these movement of plants that reflect the movement of people, the movement of animals. They were surrounded by forests of persimmon and nut trees. And then they had milpa-like agriculture on the outskirts of household areas. So something that we see that's really similar. But interestingly, between the period between which Angel Mounds thrived and then was abandoned around 1450, and the way that we see maize today, relationships have changed really dramatically. So that's going to be one of the areas of focus and understanding why that happened. So in the book, I try and make a bridge between two seemingly really disparate stories. The grassroots food sovereignty of Tlaxcala and industrial farming landscapes in Indiana. The idea behind this is to untangle histories of settlement, erasure, and resistance held by people who are working closely with corn. This connection might seem out of place in the present. Political borders and settler languages and cultures have erased the movement that used to occur freely across the Americas. But maize and other plants like the maypop or purslane are memory holders of this connection. One of the theoretical frameworks that I use to ground this research is this idea of collective continuance. So this is coming from Kyle Powis-White, who is an indigenous environmentalist. And one of the arguments that he makes is that to understand some of the changes that have happened in the Americas in the last 500 years, we have to understand how settler communities imposed a completely new understanding of relationships to land, relationships to one another, ways of survival. So strategies of survival are woven into the way we view the world, what we think is possible, what we think is, how we think we should relate to one another. And in the Americas in the 16th century, European settlement erased and destroyed indigenous worldviews and imposed a capital-centered framework. So even though this framework is dominant in mainstream society now, what this presentation shows is there's parallel indigenous frameworks that continue in pockets of space. And we can see this particularly in relationships to land and in strategies of production. So one of the interesting things here that I'm trying to image is showing how industrial maize and milpa farming have a lot of differences in terms of what the values are, what the goals are, what the outputs are. But we see this overlap that happens in small scale farms and gardens that might not necessarily come from individuals who are indigenous, but a lot of the same contexts that created indigenous worldviews of how to survive, create in collaboration with nature are also being repeated in context of other types of poverty or stress. So ways that the environment can become a collaborator when social systems are not. So thinking about the sterile, factory-filled blue-collar history of Indiana seems really different from the lively fields of Tlaxcala, but one of the things that has helped me make these connections has been teaching to students who talk about their childhood spent on farms, in kitchen gardens, hunting trips, foraging. So this opened up my perspective to a lot of different experiences of Indiana beyond these industrial farms. These are stories of how land provided food when the paychecks didn't, and how grandparents carried memories of victory gardens and pawpaw harvests, teaching their grandchildren, while the generation in between of their parents worked long shifts at factories. It seemed like discordant lives shared common themes, histories and experiences of disconnection, and the pockets of community born from moments of difficulty. So I want to return to introduce you to the milpa for those of you who are not familiar with this strategy of farming. This is a model that I think embodies this idea of collective continuance, how this way of being in the world has continued even while industrial agriculture has spread so violently around the Americas and beyond. One of the things that I argue by using this model is that part of this collective continuance, part of the maintenance of this way of relating to land, to plants, to one another, isn't just carried by humans. It's carried by the plants, the animals, the fungi, the insects themselves in the way that they interact and the way that we're welcomed into that interaction when we participate as collaborators. So the milpa is highly studied in Mexico. It is the point of pride for Mexican culture. It has been co-opted by many state projects as a way to talk about the power and the strength of Mexican citizens. And so a lot of these illustrations are coming from state projects that have done beautiful watercolors of all the details. I don't know how much you can see back there, but this image of the milpa, you can see little bees and grasshoppers, and there's some squash and beans, some wild greens, and then the maize is in the middle. So this is a model that's been adapted by thousands of different cultures over tens of thousands of years. It's a series of relationships made up of beings in constant feedback. Many milpa are built from generations of careful adjustments, both human and other than human, that respond to the ecological and cultural niche within which they grow. More than an ancient tradition, the milpa is a scientific and social model that efficiently and effectively yields a broad array of food, plant medicines, and strategies to strengthen local community. Milpan in Nahuatl translates to plots sown on top of each other. And it's traditionally a mix of maize, beans, chilies, and different types of squash, as well as other things. So within the way that the milpa grows, there's this idea of this tripartite kind of relationship. So we have the domesticated plants things like maize or beans that have been selected for over thousands of years to choose their colors, flavors, sizes of kernel. And these are highly controlled by humans. Often they need humans to be able to seed again and to be pollinated. Then we have cultivars. So these are plants that grow around these domesticated plants, have relationships to humans, and will probably show up near households because of their relationship to how the soil gets trodden on, or how the milpa itself gets watered, or these different relationships. And so they're kind of in loose relationship with humans, but aren't completely reliant on them. And then we have wild plants, which are also what in industrial relationships are called weeds. So there's a vast amount of different ones. But the important thing to note about these weeds is that they're not controlled by humans, right? And one of the things that is important about that lack of control is that they reproduce and adapt quickly and adjust to changing climate factors much more rapidly than things like domesticates and cultivars. So they're kind of this independent species that's just has high turnover and is constantly checking, like, you know, is it hotter this year? Is it colder this year? Are we in a period of rain? And adapting in that way. And so they have really high genetic diversity. And they also are really high nutrient holders in the milpa. So understanding the role of these weeds or other non-productive crops in campesino and pre-colonial food systems reveals an invisible dimension to strategies of survival. Weeds serve as a metaphor for all the networks of support that become background noise in human and production-centric ecologies. Not only that, but the cultural disparagement of weeds is biologically flawed. Their genetic diversity often leads them to become the most nutrient-rich version of their species. Wild plants embody the concept of interconnection and the horizontal networks of interaction that characterize milpa food systems. In the context of the milpa, I recenter the sovereignty of wild plants as key players in what Kyle Powis-White calls the collective capacity of indigenous ecologies. Food is born from an ecological system filled with beings who are in constant state of adaptation and change. This is how the system survives. Seeing food in this way, not just as a metabolic snack, but as a support network that can be rich and multifaceted, homogeneous and fragile, reveals the other than human histories and actions that help shape and explain how and why people like the campesinos of Tlaxcala are still farming in the way that they do, even as their way of life disobeys the logic of modernization. In industrial farming, consumers rarely reflect on the collaboration of lives that brought crops into being, be it the microbiomes of the soil, the bees that help pollinate, the wild plants that drove pests away from the tree's sweet fruits. This disconnection is by design, part of the same history that has led to the dismemberment of the family farm in the US Corn Belt, replacing it with uniform rows of corn planted, watered, sprayed, and harvested by machine. This history is tied to post-World War II ideologies of production and wealth and a new world order had the singular focus of manufacturing money-making crops. Within this lens emerged the category of weed, used to refer to plants that threatened the productivity of central crops. So in this image, these are only some of all of the different types of plants that are edible from the milpa that are considered weeds. So we have Chenopodium, Amaranthus, different kinds of squash flowers, and also the squash, what are those? Tendrils. We have different flowers from trees. And they have, this is a really interesting map because they have how intense the relationship to humans manipulation is, or human interaction is. And so all of these are edible. Some of them are going to be found absolutely everywhere, like purslane. And they're kind of wild, tolerated, protected, fomentada, fostered, helped along, yeah, cultivated and domesticated. And so you can see this range of how much interaction they require to be maintained. So the point of talking about weeds in this way is to think about how Tlaxcalteca sovereignty in the past and in the present is closely tied to this idea of food sovereignty, or access and relationships to particular food sources. It's defined by collaborative relationships to the landscape and ecosystem that strengthen and support human adaptation to political threats. One of the questions that I'm asking here is how these shifting relationships to weeds, so weeds as something that's a pest, something that you want to control, something that you want to remove, versus something that can support you that can be a source of food when your crop fails, how those end up trickling down into social and economic frameworks. So to answer these questions and to look at these topics, I rely on interspecies methodologies. So those include archaeological methodologies, looking at ancient diets through dietary isotope studies, paleobotanical analysis, so looking at the presence of ancient plants, ancient DNA analysis from burials, from fauna and flora from the site, material analysis. And again, this archaeology, I did not do it all. This is a collaborative project, so it's kind of working together with large groups of people. Material analysis of the space, material remains, the use of agricultural areas, and ecosystem reconstruction, which is the most recent area of research that I'm embarking on, collaborating with our archaeologists, agroecologists, campesinos, ecologists to kind of think of what does it mean to look at what the agricultural space looked like before the Spanish arrived, and how can that help us respond to some of the issues that we're dealing with today. There's also a lot of early colonial literature that documents the extensive knowledge of other than human life in Mesoamerica. Also a series of early agroecological studies that were specifically done in Tlaxcala, which is really interesting. One of the great agroecologists was born in Tlaxcala and then trained in Cornell. So there's an interesting overlap there of like these two worldviews and how they've been repurposed. And then Tlaxcala is also currently the center of a lot of contemporary agroecological studies and social movements. So relying on that research as well. And then a final component of what I work with is ethnographies, shadowing campesinos in Tlaxcala, participating in food sovereignty organizations and meetings, hearing about what some of the problems are, what some of the solutions are, how they're organizing, and co-analyzing the results, the ways that I interpret things, going back and having conversations with the campesinos themselves to decide, am I getting the main points correct, or am I imposing some other view of them? So I'm not going to go too much into the archaeology, so I just want to focus on some visuals. When I started the archaeological project, I was working with dietary isotope studies, which is basically how human bodies or how bodies incorporate the foods that they eat into the molecular structure of their bones and teeth and tissues, and how you can then measure the amount of carbon and nitrogen in bodies to get a map of where they fall on a web of food and understand generally what kinds of things people were eating. So this is what one of those food webs, a traditional food web, might look like. You see herbivorous, carnivorous, marine foods as kind of main categories. And then we see two different types of plants, ones that are arid adapted, called C4 plants because of how they trap carbon, and ones that are the majority of plants before this period of great drought, where things like maize and grasses and cacti started to evolve in our history. So it's a very simple map. And one of the things that I found as I was doing research is that this map didn't capture things like it didn't capture things like insects or like cacti, which are key factors in survival strategies in Mesoamerica. So through my work, and I don't know if y'all can see these little drawings, but each drawing represents the point of the values from that plant. So we have like a nopal over there, amaranth, maguey, another type of nopal, a bunch of different types of maize. And over here we have a bunch of different flowers, beans, squashes. And when I first started doing this research, basically this was kind of the visual, the map that I was working with. So it looked like people were eating a lot of maize because that was really the only domesticated crop that people were considering. They were looking at like the main axis of the milpa. They weren't looking at all the other different parts of life that existed there. And so you can see that once we started adding in these other values of other types of plants, so what we did was we sampled the plants that were mentioned in codices, plants that milpa farmers were using, and found the different values for those. And you could see that they really strengthened this idea of it's not just maize. There's a lot more that falls in a similar range. There's nopal up there, amaranth, that broadens our understanding of survival. They weren't just like eating a ton of maize and like being unhealthy, but rather they had this vast range of plants that were supporting them. So to show you just an example of this, I'm gonna use the example of maguey. So all of these plants that are in the C4 range are plants that can survive the dry heat and scalding sun of Mexico, central Mexico highlands, especially during years where little rain fell. Maize is one of those plants that's really well known. But what these samples showed is that there are a lot of other plants that fell within those categories. Here, we're going to be talking about maguey. And these plants evolved during moments of environmental stress and developed water-saving tactics that allowed them to survive while other life withered. They were never fully domesticated, and their wildness placed them in a world outside of human control. Their body is serving as a vessel that connects daily life on Earth with the ethereal world of the gods. A lot of these plants, actually amaranth, maguey, and nopal, used to be very highly ritual plants. And a large relationship to that. And if you know anything about Mesoamerican worldview, you know, maize is also seen as this plant that connects the underworld to the sky, is the center of everything. And if you look at it in a different way, they're really important to surviving. And so they take on this, this ethereal element. But if we're only looking at this with a product-centered lens, we're missing a lot of these relationships. And so for the maguey, I'm going to use an example of one of the people that I interviewed, Don Jaime, who has a pulque business and who I shadowed and who I've had many conversations with, showing all the different ways that maguey becomes used. So it is used for aguamiel, which is a non-alcoholic drink that comes out of the center of the plant once you start to take out its heart, and can produce, like, it's almost like coconut water. Like, it produces this really nutrient-rich liquid when there's no other water around. Once fermented, that becomes pulque. Contemporarily, pulque is used to combat diabetes. So it's a cacti, and cacti have these properties that cleanse out toxins from the body. And you can see the use of them in pre-colonial times here in the codex. We also saw evidence of how they were used to make fibers. Most of the clothes, when cotton wasn't available, were made out of ishle, which is the fiber from the maguey. They also create a whole network of life. So there's bottom here, maguey worms, which were fried. Up here, this is Don Jaime on the left. And last year they won a great honor for A que sabe la patria, what does heritage taste like in Mexico? And they won an award for one of their recipes, which is the heart of the maguey wrapped in maguey leaves and steamed. And so there's all of these different ways that maguey becomes not just a food, a way to connect one another, a way to make clothing, a way to solve problems, a way to find resources, that make it a lot more than just a product, just a domesticated agricultural product. Excuse me. The other category of plants, which is over here on the yellow-orange side, are what we would mostly consider to be the weeds. And so in the pre-colonial area, ethnohistoric documents show approximately 164 wild plants that fell under this category of what in Mexico is called quelites. It comes from the Nahuatl quilitl, and it encompasses a range of wild edible greens like guasontle, which is a chenopodium, quelite cenizo, another chenopodium, also known as lamb's quarters, aromatic herbs like papalo and epazote. Contemporary studies of this food category demonstrate the relationship between quelites and disease prevention, documenting levels of iron, potassium, calcium, and zinc equivalent to that of grains like spinach and chard, but surpassing these market grains in protein levels. 40 years ago, Tlaxcala-born agroecologist Efraim Hernandez Xolocotzi led a wave of studies of traditional farmers in Tlaxcala to understand how their contemporary agroecosystems functioned. Among these various helpers were the weeds. And so here's a quote from one of those studies, that farmers do not refer to these plants as weeds, but rather as hierbas, arbences, or quelites. Therefore, many of these plants are deliberately left in the field as a second crop. In fact, there's evidence that Tlaxcalan farmers actually sponsor wild plants in their fields through selective weeding. These weeds serve another purpose. They trap pests who will choose to eat these high nutrient greens, leaving the central crops like maize alone. So these relationships really change the way we think about what a weed is, why we don't want it, what it can help to do. And it gives a certain level of agency to these plants as beings who are invested in the maintenance of a life-giving network, right? So it's not just about producing food for humans, but through their existence, they're creating networks between insects, between mycorrhizomes, between all of these different types of life that are required to create a healthy and highly productive food system for humans, but also a system of life that is just vast. And this is one of the things that has helped individuals survive social crises, is this relationship of the milpa. Because it is so multifaceted, it can adapt in ways that are unexpected, in ways that are not driven by human decisions of how to relate to a moment of drought or how to deal with increased fires. Having such high biodiversity means that there is going to be something that survives that is able to adapt to a particular circumstance. In Tlaxcala specifically, this has helped Tlaxcaltecas to survive the expansion of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs surrounded the state and closed off trade. So this was something that allowed them to rely on what was locally available, allowed them to respond distinctly to the Spanish crown when colonialism began to expand different ways of relating to agriculture, and currently is helping to support responses to Western global industrialism and GMO core. And Tlaxcala is the center of a lot of anti-GMO movements. They were one of the first places to make it illegal for GMO corn and seeds to be grown and planted in that state. And it's something that has followed and expanded to much of Mexico. And one of the things that is at the center of this idea is this idea that humans aren't the only decision makers in these spaces. The plants, the animals, the soil, the water are also actors that help regulate how food is created. And we can see this in our analysis at Tepeticpac through foodways. So through the dietary isotope studies, we were able to find like general categories of what kinds of foods were there. But collaborating with ethnobotanists who were able to look for plant cells, we found evidence of maize, beans, sweet potatoes, and maguey in the teeth of burials. And then we were, from that, we began to collaborate with people who were studying ancient DNA and found sunflowers, chia, peanuts, tomatoes, squash, peppers. We also saw evidence of some external trade, pineapple and cacao. And then we also saw some relationships that went beyond the milpa. So things like freshwater fish, ducks, pheasants, turkeys, freshwater mussels, and some grasshoppers. So what this shows is this interconnection, this really vast interconnection, and an awareness of the limits of human agency and the need for collaboration. When talking to Jaime about his maguey fields, he mentioned, since we don't use any agrochemicals, in the fields there's still herbs that show up, wild fruits that have been lost in other places and aren't found anymore. And we still have these plants, for example, the tlayote, the apipisco, the jaltomate, the tlanochtle, that are wild fruits that have always existed. The berries, there's wild blackberry and other wild berries that we still have in our lands because we protected them. And we don't apply agrochemicals because where they spray herbicides, they kill all type of plants. So the only thing that survives is the plant they want to produce. So these ideas aren't just happenstance. It's not just like the farmers don't know that these are weeds and they should take them out, but rather is an intentional relationship that has been upheld through time. So by looking at sustainability in this way, not as something that humans need to impose on an environmental landscape, but as something that the landscape is also helping to maintain, we start to see how it is that this way of life was able to survive significant changes and ecological and political crises across time. So I want to go back to our first archaeological experience, my first archaeological experience of the site in 2015. We were going to excavate a terrace to find out what architecture had been there, but the terrace was planted with the corn for that year's milpa. And so you can see here in the image us kind of looking at all of this beautiful little like teenage corn that we were going to have to rip up. And as we were ripping it up, we found out that we ripped up the wrong milpa. It was somebody else's milpa. And this kind of became part of the beginning of my interrogation of what exactly archaeology is looking for, right? It's looking for material remains, but soil, the quality of the soil, the fact that these corn plants were even here in this moment, what other weeds were growing there are also holders of memory, are also holders of information, not just the human materials that are left behind. So I pulled this quote from Uzma Rizvi's piece, Archaeological Encounters, the Role of Speculative in Decolonial Archaeology, where she says, what we write up in our reports is caveats to our research, the various criteria that we cannot control, but that significantly alter the results of our work, like environmental conditions, ground cover, can be considered not only something we cannot control, but an actor, a stakeholder, a participant in our discussion of research. So for me, that moment was something that really pushed back at just humans being the only ones that are holding history, that are shaping history, shaping relationships. So building on La Economía como Nicho Ecológico by Laura Colin Arguindegui, who's in Tlaxcala, anthropologist in Tlaxcala. I present the idea of the weeds as kind of mimicking economic frameworks that have also popped up as alternatives. So we can see domesticates as kind of the formal economy, the thing that we all engage in, the state sanctioned kind of banks, the main axis of our everyday lives, but something that if there's change, if there's sudden collapse, they aren't able to adapt very well. Then we see cultivars. So this is something maybe like household economies, your neighbors that you buy eggs from, or like the farmer's market. And I was thinking about like the market bucks at our farmers markets here that like are very idiosyncratic, right? They're only available to be used in that one space, but there's an agreement of how they're used. And so there's some structure. And then we see things like weeds. So these are innovative, unexpected economies. They're subject to constant adaptation, like we saw during the early pandemic when we saw a lot of mutual aid pop up that didn't really have a precedent. They were kind of being made in the moment to respond. They may share commonalities across contexts. So we saw those mutual support networks pop up in a lot of different places around the world. They had things in common, but they were also very context specific and adapted to a particular moment, a particular place, a particular need. So I want to read this quote from one of the other interviewees, Seferino, who's a nopal farmer, who once said, this is how Tlaxcaltecans survived because they adapt to the plants, they adapt to the animals. There's communication, work is done cooperatively, not subordinately. To subordinate, that's the concept of dominance, also called the concept of capitalism. So from this idea, I've seen how one of the ways that people are able to keep this alternative framework active is by working together with environment, by working together with what is available in the surrounding ecology and not just with other people. And just to give an example of some of these like wild or maybe cultivar economies, the Colectivo Tianguis de Trueque is kind of like a trade system where there's no money exchanged in this market. You arrive and you just have something of value to you that you brought. So people will bring like jewelry or like old clothes or some pears from their tree. Or once I went and drew drawings of people and I traded them for goods. And so this is something that has reappeared in the last 10 years in Tlaxcala on a kind of more popular level, right? So this is held in one of the central cultural plazas and is part of this like new youth movement of readapting some of the practices that have existed in the past in new contexts, not necessarily because everybody has to trade, but just keeping that memory of trade alive. So from this work, I have developed a kind of loose framework of milpa sustainability, how it's different from this idea of sustainability as a human-centered framework. One of the components is this idea of holistic sustainability. So not just thinking about how to sustain production, how to sustain the constant creation of crops, but thinking about how to create a community that's sustainable, a community where people aren't burnt out, a community that is happy and satisfied with the different types of work that they're doing, a community where you are also taking into consideration the plants and the animals and their well-being and whether they're balanced. A lot of this is engaged through embodied learning, which is something that is lost in industrial agriculture, not being physically on the ground, touching, smelling, watching changes happen with season, watching changes happen with global changes. It's also something that is a type of learning that all members of the community can engage in. Little kids can be out there and notice. Elders can share their experiences of multi-generational awareness of a space. And so all of these are things that I see as being central to why this is a practice that has continued and is so successful in Tlaxcala. So I'm going to end the presentation by talking about the Healing Garden, which is located here on campus at the Hilltop Garden and Nature Center. And I want to start talking about the Healing Garden by talking about this term food sovereignty. So there are a lot of different ways that food sovereignty have been talked about, but Kyle Powys-White and other Indigenous scholars argue that it is not just about access to particular foods or grown in particular ways, but it's about having the right to define your relationships, having your right to define your relationships to the soil, to the water, to the air, to the sun, to the plants, to the bees, all of these different relationships that are involved in food creation. And how in places that we think of as modern, as privileged, like Indiana, we actually have very little food sovereignty. We have very little control over the quality of the water that's going into our fields. We have very little control over the air that is getting consistently filled with more and more chemical spills and fires. And so thinking about how that ends up shaping our relationships, not just to our food system, but to one another, how those things kind of domino effect into our society largely. So the idea behind the Healing Garden is that it emerged as a place to try to cultivate and pull forth relationships, taking inspiration from the practices of the milpa. We planted all different colors of maize, amaranth, beans, squash, whatever people wanted to see grow and what people were curious about growing. Sesame, chia, mugwort, tobacco, devil's claw. And then also the land kind of participated as well and put out dill, chamomile, and kale, memories of its previous iteration as the campus farm space or as a community garden space. And then we also had native plants that cropped up, things that invited us to learn more about the landscape, learning about pokeweed, whether it's poisonous, it is, but you can also use it in different ways as a healing herb to reduce swelling and skin issues. Why those plants are here, kind of the way that the presence of these plants invites curiosity to learn more about their history in the place. As we began to know the patch of earth, we were also digging into its past and our own past and reaching to understand how Bloomington lands have been meticulously cared for by native tribes of the Mississippian and woodland period, and how that then became homesteads, family farms, industrial cornfields, and finally our campus. So here are some images of some of the activities that we've done, but one of the things that I think is most visible in the garden is the way that all of the acts of maintaining food end up creating these networks of support. So things like preparing the soil in the spring, planning for the future garden, the act of planting, tending, harvesting, processing, and seed saving. All of these are not just about food. They're about creating networks of support. They're about having spaces of conversation. They're about creating a relationship to a place that you go back to again and again, and you observe changes, kind of a baseline place from which to observe how the world is changing. And so here you can see this was one of our first milpa. This was in the fall, later that semester, harvesting it, students learning about the different parts of the corn as they harvested. Nobody had ever tried the cane of the corn, which is like a sugar cane. So we had that and got to see like corn silk, have it as a tea. And then at the top here, I think we are drying herbs. So even in the winter time, there's activities that engage people with the space. To some visitors, the Healing Garden might look disorganized, like the links between Indiana and Tlaxcala. The relationships that occur in the garden aren't in tidy rows, and it can be hard to tell where one ends and the others begin. New volunteers will stare dazed at the multi-layered clouds of green, blur of unrecognizable faces. Which are the weeds, they'll ask. Slowly, they learn the names, dandelion, thistle, oxalis, plantain, and with enough visits, they begin to see these plants, not as intruders or disobedient pests, but as collaborators that communicate key information about a shared world and a shared history. My desire with the garden, as with the book, is to bring blurred relationships into focus and understand the overlapping histories that brought us to our current moment. My classes rely heavily on the garden now. It's milpa, a portal to find alternative paths, inspired by a milpa 2,000 miles away in Tlaxcala. So here are some of the ways that we've kind of cross-pollinated with other things going on, and y'all are welcome to come and participate, visit. On Tuesdays, we do gleaning in the garden, which is going around to all the other plots that have various relationships of visitation and gathering what is about to over ripen and taking it to the crimson cupboard. We also recently had an event where we invited La Muchacha y su propio junte, which is a band that does kind of campesino resistant songs from Colombia. Come and engage with the space. We've also had visitors from Tlaxcala. So we're trying to kind of use it as a space to bring people together to think about how our stories and our experiences are interconnected. We also have the Jardín Curativo, which is the Spanish version of the garden where we have bilingual events, because what we've found is that there's a big population in Bloomington of Spanish-speaking immigrants. We currently only have like Spanish-speaking students involved, so we'd love to expand this to a broader array. But thinking about how spaces like the Healing Garden, the Jardín Curativo, and their relationship to these plants also connect to senses of memory, senses of autonomy and sovereignty in a new space where perhaps those experiences are not available. We also have open hours on Friday from 4 to 7 and open hours on the second and fourth Saturdays of every month. If you want to learn more about any of these things, there's a documentary that we created about the work done in Tlaxcala, article that's open access. Go to the Healing Garden website. We also have a few zines, lots of stories and blogs and things that you can check out there. And I just want to end by saying thank you to you all for listening and to the Healing Garden team, Dr. Olga Calencido, Diana Ojeda, A.B. Scherschel, who couldn't be here today, Tlaxcala collaborators, plant and animal collaborators, and all the funding sources that have helped us over the past 5 years. Thank you.
It's super good.
Thank you, Edu. Does anybody have any questions, comments, reflections? Okay.
I don't have a question. Thank you so much for this talk. I just want to draw parallels in the Healing Garden and what you are talking about in terms of sustainability, especially in making connections, brings back a lot of us to the connections that we make in our own environments in other parts of the world. And I think that's also really important when we talk about methodologies of teaching about sustainability and how we test out those ideas in a space such as the Healing Garden. So your talk about weeds and they are not classified as weeds brings back things in my culture that are also not classified as weeds. They are called the wild things, that they're wild edibles. And I think what your talk does is open up all those avenues to explore those themes in other contexts. So thank you for that.
We'll have to talk and add piece and to the history of I have a comment in here asking I think the milpa is also about health, as in the goals of having public health, not only healthier foods, but more generally healthier lives. What do you think of regenerative farmers in the US and the Midwest learning about milpas when looking for alternatives, given the destruction of conventional ag? Sent a link to a project in Nebraska. I think one of the interesting, lines to balance on, and we did a project with the what's the first year student?
No.
Environmental, sustainability scholars, yeah, sustainability scholar. 2 years ago, where we interviewed a few small scale farmers. And I think it comes back to kind of, let me see the image, this value system, and how much that you are actually shifting the value system that you're putting in place, because you can grow organic, you can, like all of these things that, yes, they aren't using harsh chemicals, but are you considering the relationships that you have to the beings in the space, or are you still taking this hierarchical relationship of kind of dominance and forcing the space? Because I don't know, for us specifically in the garden, I think one of the things that I learned quickly was that I don't have the capacity to do industrial anything. I'm burnt out, and the plants actually, cover our backs. Like, they get in there and do something. It might not be what we had expected. But I think, yeah, I think that there are a lot of inspirations to take, but I think that they shouldn't just be picked up and plopped into a new context. I think you need to understand the histories, the relationships. Where are you in that history, in that relationship? What do you need to unlearn? What do you need to unlearn about how you're thinking about collaboration with your community, collaboration with your people who are working in your space? What kind of power dynamics are at play? So it's like, the milpa has been a practice. I wouldn't say that we are operating it like the campesinos that I learned from, because we have all kinds of things that we're unlearning. We're academics, we are perfectionists. It is really hard to let go of that, even in a farming space. And I think the first few years were really tense. We're slowly starting to enjoy it a bit more. I mean, it's always been enjoyable, but I think let go a little bit more. But I think all of those things, that on our website, we have a link to a really interesting document that talks about like unlearning a lot of these inherited aspects of white supremacy, of perfectionism, of urgency, of individualism, and how hard it is to strip that out of you and, collaborate with, like, I think about my students working on group projects and how much they hate it. And like, oh, the individualism, like, we just have to practice not doing that. Like, it is harder when you're working with somebody who has a different perspective and a different thought from you, but it's going to create something different. And that's what we're trying to do.
And follow up on that, I think that, the idea of the healing garden as a lab, I think, to me, is super compelling because of other things that I've been reading in abolition ecologies, in other critiques that push us to think about prefigurative politics. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, working for the world that we want and not for the one that we have, and how that implies, doing research differently, thinking differently about these spaces. So that is to me very, very powerful and something that I love sharing. Also, from your work, I wanted to highlight, how important it is to think about how doing in common looks like, what you make in common, and how you're constantly doing it. So a processual understanding of common spaces, how they come into being, how they are sustained, defended. To me, that was also super inspiring. And my question is about scale, and I think that connects with Olga's comment. Is like, you can feel so many connections here, those aha moments where you're like, it is not possible that this weed is here because, this is the weed that my grandma has in her backyard. How many times I've said that, when I go to the healing garden, I'm like, no, this is guascas. Guascas are for ajiaco. They're so difficult to find. My mom brings them whenever she comes visit in a package, and now I see them in the healing garden, those connections. And the question about a scale is, of course, a classic geographical one, because we think all about scale and scales as produced, not as something that exists. So definitely not the nested scales of these Troshka dolls, put one inside the other. But I wanted to invite you, I don't know, with this question to tell us a little bit about scale, because people can think, oh, well, those are isolated efforts that are so small and meaningless. But if you think, and I'm here thinking with the feminist, political ecologist impulse, that they are only isolated and minor because we produce them as such. They are actually huge, and they make the difference between life and death. They are really about sustaining life where everything is against it, that they're not small and isolated at all. So if you could maybe, yeah, I see a lot from your understandings of milpas and milpas as a way of being. I see that a lot, like a challenging the idea of what matters, what counts, what is big, what is revolutionary, what is meaningful.
Yeah, well, I think Edu has done a really great job with the exhibit that's currently in the IUMA. That's about connecting, what is it called again? I'm sorry.
It's right here.
Yeah, the exhibit.
Locally based, globally relevant.
Yeah, if you have a chance to go check it out, I think it's a really good example of how to take these little case studies and connect them and show that they're like termites. They're little stories all over the place that are slowly wearing away. But I also think about like when I teach community-based research, I think one of the frustrating things is that this work takes a long time and you can't see it. It's very faith-based work in terms of like, I'm just gonna trust that even though everybody is telling me that I'm wasting my time. And I think that's part of the unlearning process of these kind of indigenous methodologies and frameworks, is that there's a lot of invisible moments that are accumulating over time. Like if you think of it with the garden metaphor, building soil takes a really long time and holds a lot of memories of a lot of like failures, a lot of like mistakes, but then after through time you start to get this really rich history built up. And I think it's similar, where when you just have a case study, it might feel frustrating. And I think it's important to connect all of these stories to remember that it's something that's cumulative, and that cumulative aspect makes it more deeply rooted, stronger than something that's just produced in like a grant cycle, and that will have impacts that perhaps you can't see in the moment. Like we have in the comments, a question from Margarita, who's a student in history, was one of the first people who was in the garden, also from Colombia, and is now doing an incredible dissertation project on women and children in peasant communities, resistance uprisings in Colombia, and using a lot of the things that you would say like we were playing with in the garden in terms of hosting events that are art-centered, storytelling that aren't like research methodologies as interpreted in an academic framework, but that are ways that you can get at versions of stories that won't happen if you're like, I need to do a survey and an interview and quantify all of this. And so I think that's one example of how, 3 years ago, it was just Margarita volunteering in the garden, and now it's grown into new methodology that she's pushing forward in history. And I think those are kinds of the pathways that we see people start to take, and I don't know, just remembering that it's happening.
So I have a question related to domestication that is kind of related to this. It's some of these plants that we're talking about. So it seems that now we have evidence that they have relatively high nutrition value, and then on top of that, they are providing nutrients when there is high levels of scarcity of other plants. So in my mind, then the incentives to domesticate those plants were probably huge, but they did not get domesticated. Do we have any ideas of why that happened? Are we talking about the set of domesticates that we have probably can affect their incentives to domesticate? Is there any evidence that they were kind of on track of domestication, but then something happened and then they didn't complete the cycle of domestication? Or I don't know, or the available evidence, it's completely silence on this? Because it seems an important question. It's in general, what is domesticated and what not. But this is strike as a very important case, because if we are talking about something that doesn't provide good nutrients, and you may have an explanation, but then on top of that, you have something that is providing nutrients when all the other things are scarce. So it's even better, It's a better target for domestication. And then, by the way, some of the people that you are interviewing, it doesn't seem to me what we are doing very different from the historical process of domestication. You allow some things to grow in your area and you kill some other things, and then you are domesticating some things, no? So again, I don't have training in archaeology or anthropology, but I'm interested in the domestication process. And I think it's again, maybe it's a too broad question and you
No,
will
I mean,
escape the question, no?
I think, I don't know concretely what to refer you to in terms of resources, but I think one of the things that I would posit is that keeping these greens, most of them are greens. I think that's one factor, is that they're not necessarily fruit bearing plants, so they're not selecting for larger fruits. It's just a green, but they actually benefit more when they're wild because they can adapt quickly to change. Whereas if you're domesticating something, you're slowly weeding out. You're slowly like selecting for a particular outcome that you're choosing, that the plant itself is not choosing, and the plant might have access to information about, you know, the root systems or like moisture in the soil that you as a human might not be as aware of. And so I think part of the idea behind it is that they're abundant, they reproduce way faster than like main crops. So they're going to be adapting constantly. And if we let them be wild, then they will adapt. And that's why they're able to stick around when there are changes. And if you were to domesticate them, you would take away some of that kind of agency to change and the genetic variability. So that's what I would hypothesize. Olga might know more.
I want to add something to what we are discussing because this comes up in a lot of my classes, and I teach food classes from graphic and archaeological perspective. And the first question is domestication. And when I take the students to the healing garden and we point to what you said, and I point out to the extreme variety of the things that you can eat, the question comes up exactly the same. So why didn't we domesticate that? And I want to point to two things that I see in the literature. One, that the idea of domestication is very much a Western idea. In our thought, and archaeology is a Western discipline. And B, when that domestication paradigm was established, we were only looking archaeologically for only the things that we thought would be ecologically possible in that area. So when you are in a dig, I'm a professional archaeologist, but not anymore, you are always selecting for things that you think and the paradigm tells you to look for. It is only recently that we started looking at charred remains and the pollen of other species and understanding this broad ecosystem. So when we talk about Three Sisters, for example, in this part of the world, we're fixated on Three Sisters, but I will quote my husband, who is a Midwest archaeologist, talking about 16 sisters, 17 sisters, 18 sisters. And those sisters are what Keitlyn is very eloquently talking about, the fowl that comes near your water source that you have for food, the cattails, the chenopodium, the lamb's quarter, the purslane much later, all these nutrient dense things that you don't really need to domesticate because your environment provides. And even with the trees, no grafting has been done in North America, not because they didn't see the reason or domesticate animals in this part of the world. Either they didn't see the reason or their understanding about their environment was very multi-species as opposed to different parts of the world that were stressed in a different way. I think about all these things similarly, and I don't see the absence of domestication as actually the end result of how we view ourselves as a society. But those are my crazy ideas.
I would say, but at the end, in pretty much every part of the planet, some plants and animals went through a process.
Yeah.
Maybe the term domestication is not the right one, but went through a process in which humans ended up selecting those things. another species and animals didn't go through that process. And I think it's a valid question to ask why yes and why no, even, or maybe reconsidering the whole process on, hey, maybe they were not just selecting one species, they were just trying to modify the whole environment, and in the process we're selecting some species. So maybe the way I read your point is maybe we need to reconsider the theory of domestication through the lens of this perspective. I
I'll
see.
give Luis, then Lucia, then Edu. I'm keeping the order, then Julia, so.
There's also Margarita has a question on.
Okay, and then Margarita, so,
The comment on the.
yes, also a comment, so Luis.
Okay, thank you for such a great presentation. I've been taking notes all around. And I have just like 3 ideas, but when you were presenting, I got the idea that we need to think in a more anti-utilitarian way. And my question is, to what extent the values of this campesino movement in Tlaxcala is like anti-utilitarian in some sense, in the way we understand our relationship with things, relationship with plants, that we have so normalized here. Because I think if we want to think radically and out of the box, we need to think in this anti-utilitarian way and understanding how the people have been addressing this thing for centuries. And I also intrigued about the isotope, the dietary isotopes that you are being analyzing. You mentioned that this belongs to a broader thing and a broader collaboration, but if you can share a little bit more about it, it will be super interesting to me. And the other thing is like the temporality of the weeds, how much they live, how much they are entangled with other plants. You can share more about it, how it is here, how it's different in Tlaxcala.
Let's do the round. Do you agree? And then we'll give you the.
I don't know if my memory will hold it,
Okay.
but I can be quick.
Okay.
By anti-utilitarian, do you mean just like growing things for enjoyment as well as for food and not just like for food? Is that what you mean by that?
I mean, modern economics, neoliberal economics is grounded in utilitarian philosophy. That is the grounding of these things. That is the grounding of how we people in West or Westernized people understand stuff and relationship with any kind of stuff. But in other like places not Westernized entirely or dealing with other kinds of like cultural configurations, you have other ways of understanding the value of things.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's been a lot written about reciprocity. There's been a lot written about like, what's the other word I'm thinking of? Like gratitude economies as well. So, and one of the farmers, Seferino, is part of a project at a Canadian university where they're trying to measure like, they're using an app to measure productivity of the milpa. And he was like, no, you need to measure my happiness. Like you need to measure how enjoyable this work is for me, because that's an important factor of why I keep doing it. And so they added like a little space to measure like, what was your mood when you got in the milpa? What was the mood when you left? And like try and measure that, which is interesting. I mean, it kind of feels like the opposite of getting away from like quantifying it, but still interesting. Yeah, and then in terms of isotopes, anything specifically that you?
I was just thinking if it's like any kind of like difference between like how you analyze, for instance, like corn in Peru and how isotopes you are looking for in this case, like for wheats.
Well, it started as dietary isotopes from burials at the site. I started as a bioarchaeologist, and so it was looking at what the human kind of values were. And then trying to map them onto diagram of like what plants we knew about. We already knew about maize. I've moved away from humans for various like ethical reasons, and also because there's just so much to learn about the world without looking at humans. Like there's so much more than us. And so what we've been doing more recently is analyzing a lot of different types of plants to see like to fill in the gaps in the map, but also using like zooarchaeological like faunal remains from the site, working with people who are analyzing like remains on dishes, working with like ecologists who are more aware of what we should even be looking for, or like if there's things like insects that we're probably not going to find in an archaeological site because they've broken down, like how can we use parallels in other contexts, use contemporary insects to kind of reverse engineer it. So that's kind of the idea behind that. And then the temporality of weeds. Yeah, I mean, They definitely have seasonality, and one of the things that I'd like to do in the future is expand this project because it was basically like an add-on to the end of my dissertation. And I only did a field season there, so I wasn't there for the full year. One of the things that I would love to do, but I'm also like hesitant, is to create kind of a seasonal, visible movement map of all of the things that come up each season, but it also kind of exposes knowledge that, like, if you're not in the milpa observing these things, do you deserve to know that? Do you deserve to just have this information, or do you need to be caring for the space to know this? So that's one of the things that we're kind of with. And
Lucy.
Turning to your idea about rethinking domestication, I work in Peru and I work with campesino communities, and also thinking of the same, like, for instance, you were thinking about like humans domesticating, and I think the way that I've seen it done too, it's interesting, is like, for instance, agronomists were throwing fits when they were watching people putting different kinds of potatoes in the same field, and be like, oh, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? They're like, no, the potatoes will decide. You know, so like letting them kind of understand what's happening, and then taking it further. I think, Keitlyn, too, one of the things that I really enjoy about your work too is thinking about kind of like these sites of relational governance. I think about it through this lens, and in the Ayllu and Quechua communities, an Ayllu, which is a more than human community, is made up of smaller Ayllus. So you have like the Runa Ayllu, which is what is made by humans, including cultivated fields. But then you have Auki Ayllu, which is like the sacred beings, and then you have the Salka Ayllu, which is the world of wild things, wild plants, wild animals, and how all of these work in concert together in order, in kind of like this sacred relational governance, to create and regenerate life consistently. And so when we think about how these relate to one another, we could think about it in terms of domestication, but that's not their goal ever, right? I think it's so interesting to me to think about all these systems upholding each other's lives. So yeah, thank you very much.
thank you. Yeah, I think that there's definitely a difference. Still working on like how exactly to verbalize it, but just like between these, I think you sent me some resources, the like life sustaining systems versus, you know, extractive systems, like systems that are not really interested in keeping networks that will keep various forms of life alive. That's not the goal.
Right.
And we had Edu.
I really like the way you structured the talk. So just one comment on the domestication, then I'll mention my other comment. Which is, I mean, you can see the milpa is a domestication. It creates an environment that's highly selective. So just by the sake of managing it for hundreds of years, you are domesticating at a scale where, you know, you're selecting which species come in and survive there. The other thing is the abundance, right? We have variation in abundance. I think that creates different incentives. So my comment is, I think you do a really convincing story. You have 700 years, you know, of continuity and change and resilience to, you know, environmental change and social change. It's really nicely done. I think you kind of punctuated, you know, with evidence that really brings their story to the fore. My comment is that, and I think refers to a previous comment about scale, is you give us a very good sense of the past in terms of how present it was in the different, you know, diets. And it would be great to have a similar sense of the present. You know, in what ways and at what level this is being practiced in the region today. So you have a sense of continuity, you know, from the perspective of how much this is being done and is being passed on to generations, which I think is necessary in the context of, you know, of the decline of the systems, which is a big part of this story. There's a lot of decline in the systems like milpa and in the communities of farming who are cultivating them. So that story is on the background still, right? And I think it would be great for you to confront that story you know, and say, oh, this is our, you know, the people who are practicing it and engaging it, you know, and continuing it in today's context. So I think that would really nice wrap up the story that, you know, 700 years of continuity, as you said, which I think you supported it very nicely and in a very innovative way.
So lucky because I just heard that talk from you. Just did that a week ago.
Yeah, so I think that would be a nice. One other comment, you know, wild species economies, although this is very broad, you know, like wild fish and so forth, is one of the world's largest economy. 1.2 people in the world depend or relate to wild species economy. I think that could also, you know, getting some of those sources will give you a sense. This is globally relevant, you know, in that sense.
And that was the economy that early colonialists actually decimated in the United States, especially in this part of the world with the swamp being eradicated and the great Kankakee Marsh gone. So that is exactly.
Yeah, it sounds of economy.
Yeah, I think for me, there is just so much narrative about destruction and the loss of these things that I really wanted to focus on the small ways that they are being maintained and the people who are maintaining. Like, there's a lot of books about NAFTA and how it destroyed the milpa. And yes, and I think that things like that, I mean, not at the scale, definitely facing a different scale. But even with, for example, early colonization that wiped out 90% of the population, the fact that it's a way of viewing the world maintained, it's like, even now, if 80% of the milpa farmers disappear, like how can we not give up? How can we be aware that there's other factors at play that are beyond corporations that are going to seek out life and seek out ways to maintain life?
Yeah, but I mean, you know, how much the young generation is being engaged with that. I think it'd be interesting for you to sort of, you know, talk about the young generation. You know, the ones that you're interviewing, that are there engaged, that are learning this process. I mean, just as a way of sort of, you know, kind of wrapping up the beautiful story that you.
Okay.
Yeah, I have another question, but I can.
There's now 2 questions in the chat.
Julia. So, and we will come back to you. So Julia, 2 questions and then Edu again.
So Keitlyn, what a rich presentation. Just the enjoyable experience of absorbing everything you've been laying out for us through your many years of work and your upcoming book, which is going to be a gift. I'm reflecting on your quotation that you ended with from the farmer who spoke about, you know, his approach of adapting to the plants, adapting to the animals, farming cooperatively with the organisms. And just reflecting on your comparison to industrial maize. And, you know, it makes me want to understand that story much better of how we came to eradicate every other plant but the one growing in monoculture, you know, but the economic plants. The sense of that story, but how did we develop all this fear of other plants? And then I reflect on, in general, like fear as a common held value in the monocultural approach. It's like, we have to do it this way because otherwise we will be in a doomsday scenario. It's like fear is so salient. And so it makes me wonder about like the shadow side of the milpa approach. Like, are there downsides? Are there trade-offs? Is fear salient within milpa? Because it's a positive story you're telling.
Well, in a previous chapter, it's actually fascinating the relationship. So dietary isotope studies, isotopes, emerged from the development of nuclear arms. And so for nuclear arms to move forward, for the argument that the US needed to use nuclear arms, basically had to ignore that we're interconnected. We basically had to just like push that to the back of our mind and say, if we drop a bomb, it's not gonna affect us. That's gonna affect other people. It's not gonna infect the soil forever or the air forever or the water forever. So there's this like ideology that starts to emerge in that like post-World War II period that's just very like disconnected. And I think fear is a part of that. I mean, there's just like lots of fear of power and who's getting the power and how it's going to be distributed. And you see that kind of repeated in so many different spaces and so many different, that's also where like industrial agriculture started to happen as well, on like a high scale. And yeah, so I think all of those things are really interconnected. And I mean, yeah, I'll think, I think I also write about a little bit my own background as somebody who is born from a family who's half Mexican, half US, and how Mexico for me is kind of like, you know, romanticized part, right? Like a lot of it is things that I wish that I had living here, that I don't have. And I know that that is a factor in my like bias and way that I write. But I also believe in biases. I believe that there are stories that are told that like maybe somebody else isn't telling because they don't see it that way. So I'll try and work that balance in. I'm just gonna read Margarita's really quick.
Then another one, then.
Okay, so Margarita's is asking about the role of women and children in preserving knowledge, memories, and practices about weeds and food-related practices. Do they have a specific role in creating common spaces? Yeah, so I guess one of like the downsides would be that most of the people that I spoke to in the milpa, and this isn't true of everyone, were men, because of the violence of the campo of these spaces that are both beautiful and also like more exposed to cases of attack if you're out in a mountainside. And so there's that factor as well, playing out in this. But again, I felt like people have written about that. I can make reference to it, but it wasn't a theme. So most of the things that are coming from women are in the kitchen, in the households, and passed down through recipes, which will be a chapter in the book where I'm looking at how the milpa and the ideologies that are coming out of it then get kind of reproduced in the kitchen through the ingredients as like a proxy for like the experience of being out in the fields, how that then gets transported into kitchen context and passed on, and how that then gets spread to like diaspora communities who buy their nopales at the grocery store and like recreate these meals as a way to recreate these connections. So yeah. You want me to read the other? All right, so So it says the discussion about nutrients brings to mind the disposal of waste from any production or processing of weeds to produce food. Are there any such as pollution? And if so, how does such waste fit into your framework? Are they in some way internalized? So of the farmers that I work with, there's a very like circular ecological network of like just recycling everything, even like one of them, when there's like frailes, which are like a bug and a beetle, will drown all the frailes and then use their bodies and like the nutrients they produce in their decay to water the plants. And so I don't see pollution in terms of like pollution as something that's going to damage long term. It's not something that I see in the way that they're farming. And then in terms of like waste products, again, I think that's part of, and one of the things that the article mentioned here, La Economía como Nicho Ecológico, also looks at is kind of these closed economies and the circulation of energy, like how much energy it takes for something to grow and live, how that gets returned to the same place that it came from versus being like shipped to somewhere else and then that becoming waste in that other place. Like, you know, how bananas are shipped very far away and then the banana peels throw it in the trash, and then that trash releases gas that doesn't have anywhere to go, and instead of going back into the soil and kind of feeding the next generation, so.
Back to you. Yeah. So, one thing that you haven't mentioned, but I wonder, how much is part of the story today is a property system.
Is what?
Property system.
Oh, okay.
These are long enduring, terraces and, I don't know how much does it fall within a ejido or what used to be a ejido land. And with the change in the ejido law 30 years ago, I'm just looking at a site here with, land for sale in a ejido in the region, like lots of lots for land for sale. So how's the property system relate to the, current milpa system?
Yeah, I think it's something that is changing and specifically has been changing a lot in the last 10 years. And a little bit like, again, aligns with like my, my lifespan. I grew up going and being around a lot of these campesino spaces, because we bought land home right when it became available to no longer be communal land, and it was surrounded by all of these farm spaces. And so I grew up, but indirectly, like I wasn't a farmer family, we bought that land, but like it's also been a space from which to observe these changes happening. I think Tlaxcala is distinct in that it's somewhat has a benefit as being a forgotten state. So in Mexico, there's always like these jokes about how Tlaxcala doesn't exist because it's so small and because it's like predominantly indigenous and like it's backwards and all of these things, but it's also meant that there has been less external investment. Like Puebla, which is just to the south, had like the Audi plant and the Volkswagen plant that have been what's it called, like shooting the chemicals into the sky so that it doesn't rain and like totally destroying crops all around there. And so far that hasn't happened in Tlaxcala, but I think that's one of the main drivers is when people are coming in and kind of taking away that sovereignty by like messing up the surrounding ecologies. And there's also not currently any like huge factories around Tlaxcala city. I think that plays a big part, but Seferino also talks about, how it's hard once your family starts to get sucked into that system, how to still keep your lifestyle while someone close to you that you're interacting with all the time is actively participating in something that's like threatening you and the way that you want to live. So yeah, I think that's another interesting path to follow. Yeah.
Time for one last question.
Yeah, going back to the fear thing, I mean, I'm wondering if we should take this back farther, if there's a historical path dependency here, right? So back when humans, wherever they were from, were worrying about survival, having enough food to survive and having regular famines because weather didn't cooperate, and knowing that weeds competed with crops for water, for sunlight, for space. They could produce toxic chemicals that could kill crops or kill livestock. And so we might have developed this mindset about good plants and bad plants. There were always movement in the direction of monoculture in the feudal era. So this is pre-capitalist, right? So I'm just wondering if maybe we get a different view of what's going on now if we go back farther into the past.
I think that's where the Mesoamerican worldview, maybe, I don't know a lot about Europe, honestly, but I know that the cosmovisions, the mythologies and the ways that people situated themselves through creation myths include a lot of like spiritual beings who are tied to multi-species plants. I don't think that weeds have been considered something that was invasive. It's rather because they also provide benefits, right? So they can especially in the very arid, very dry space, they often protect the soil from erosion. They often protect it from the water evaporating. And so having a layer of this plant isn't seen necessarily as these plants isn't necessarily seen as something that's stealing from the main crops, but rather it's like a reciprocal relationship.
It all depends where they are.
Yeah. But I think the idea that's repeated often in like the stories of creation and mythology are that it's about balance. It's about understanding how these plants, understanding the characteristics of everything that's living in the space and seeking balance within them. So if you have something that's going to take a lot of energy from your main crop, for example, you need to know its characteristics. Is it giving anything that you want in that moment in time? Would you leave some of it? You leave none of it? Will it be beneficial as like a organic ground cover in a moment where that crop isn't there? And that's, I think, why we have so many codices that just document the vast amount, like they have lists of, 150 bees that they knew. And like all of these different grasshoppers, and like we think of grasshoppers as, a plague, like as something that will destroy our crops, but they saw them also as a source of protein when, when there wasn't other sources of
You
protein.
have to look at population size, population growth rates. How many people were they trying to feed? Was it usually a pretty consistent number over a long period of time? Were they trying to get more productivity so that people weren't dying?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, you're fine.
We ran out of time.
It's okay.
Keitlyn, for your wonderful presentation. Grab their lunch. There's lunch right here. I'll go that way. And thank you again for the presentation and all of it.